She was sitting in the corner of the emergency room, one hand pressed against her belly, not moving at all, the way a person goes still when they've learned that stillness is the only protection left. Her face told the story before her mouth did. Then she leaned toward a stranger in a biker cut and whispered 8 words that would change both their lives forever. He pushed me down the stairs. The biker made one phone call, then another. By midnight, 40 men surrounded that hospital, and nobody inside was going anywhere until morning. They didn't look like heroes. That was exactly the point. Ray Callahan walked into the emergency room of St. Vincent Medical Center at 11:47 on a Tuesday night in early November, trailing the faint smell of engine grease and Arizona desert dust. His left hand was wrapped in a cloth that had started white and turned the color of rust somewhere along the 2-mile ride from the garage where he'd been working late. A grinding wheel had slipped. Rookie mistake, the kind that only happened when your mind was somewhere it shouldn't be. He'd pressed the cloth tight, taped it with electrical tape from the workbench, and ridden straight here without stopping, because that was how Ray handled most things in life, directly, without ceremony. The fluorescent lights inside St. Vincent's hit him like an interrogation. He was used to it. He had been walking into rooms and watching expressions shift for the better part of 20 years. People looked at the cut on his jacket, the winged skull, the patches spelling out Hell's Angels, the word Arizona curved beneath, and they made calculations. Their bodies would stiffen slightly. Their eyes would flick away too fast or hold too long, depending on what kind of brave they were feeling. Ray had stopped being offended by it somewhere around his 32nd birthday. Now it was background noise. He approached the triage window and gave his name to the intake nurse, a stout woman named Sandra Poole, whose reading glasses were perched at the end of her nose and who did not flinch when she looked up at him. "What happened?" she asked. "Grinding wheel," he said. "Left palm." She handed him a clipboard with a form attached and directed him to the waiting area without further ceremony. He appreciated her for that. The waiting room was the particular kind of miserable that only hospital waiting rooms managed to achieve at midnight. A fluorescent purgatory populated by people caught between one version of their lives and whatever came next. There were 8 or 10 of them scattered across the plastic chairs, a man in paint-stained coveralls holding an ice pack to his shin, a woman in her 60s with reading glasses who hadn't opened the magazine in her lap, 2 teenagers who were clearly together and clearly not speaking to each other. And in the far left corner, a woman sitting very still. She was the kind of still that caught Ray's attention. He had learned, over the course of a life that had not always been gentle, to distinguish between the stillness of peace and the stillness of survival. Animals in danger went still the same way. Soldiers who'd seen too much. People who had spent long enough in the presence of something threatening that their bodies had learned to minimize themselves in order to become a smaller target. She was young, late 20s, he guessed, with auburn hair pulled to one side and green eyes fixed on a point on the floor somewhere between her feet and the vending machine across the room. She was heavily pregnant, 7 months, maybe 8. Her left hand rested on the curve of her belly with a protectiveness that looked reflexive, like breathing. Something she no longer had to think about, and her face. There was a bruise forming along her cheekbone, high and vivid against pale skin. Her bottom lip was split, crusted at the corner with dried blood she hadn't wiped away, or perhaps hadn't noticed. The right sleeve of her sweater had ridden up slightly, and where it had ridden up, Ray could see the fingerprint-shaped marks that years of experience told him were not from any accident. He sat down 3 chairs away from her because the seat closest to the door was taken, and because sitting directly beside a frightened woman in an empty hospital waiting room at midnight would not have helped either of them. He set his clipboard on his knee, clicked the pen, and began filling out the form. He had written his name, date of birth, and was working through the checkbox for the nature of his injury when he heard the sound, barely a sound at all. more like a change in the quality of the air between them. She had turned her head and was looking at him. He met her eyes without rushing it, without the wariness or the over-friendly grin that people sometimes deployed when they wanted to prove they weren't afraid of him. He just looked back, the way one person looks at another person in a quiet room. Her mouth moved. He couldn't hear it over the ambient noise of the ER, the distant intercom, the television near the ceiling playing a late weather segment, the hum of the ice machine down the hall. He leaned forward slightly. She said it again. He pushed me down the stairs. The words were barely above a breath. She wasn't looking at him with the specific expression of someone asking for help. It seemed more like the words had been building inside her for so long, accumulating pressure in the dark, that they had finally found the nearest available exit. He happened to be it. Ray set the clipboard down on the chair beside him. He didn't reach for her. He didn't move toward her. He understood, somewhere in his chest where understanding sometimes lived before it reached the brain, that what she needed right now was not someone else moving toward her. She had had enough of that. "When?" he asked just as quietly. "Tonight." Her hand moved on her belly. "He knows I'm here. I called my sister from the car, and he—" She stopped, swallowed. "He's going to come here." Ray looked at her for a long moment, at the bruise, at the marks on her arm, at the careful way she held herself, like someone who had learned that holding herself carefully was the only protection consistently available. Then he pulled his phone from his jacket pocket. He scrolled to a contact labeled Big Duke and pressed call. It rang twice. "You asleep?" Ray asked. "Not anymore," said the voice on the other end, low, unhurried. "What's up?" Ray turned slightly away from the room and spoke quietly but without hesitation. "I need you to make some calls, and then I need you to come down to St. Vincent's ER." He paused one beat. "Bring everybody who's awake." Big Duke Harmon arrived 40 minutes later, which was impressive given that the man lived on the far side of Phoenix and had the build of a commercial refrigerator. He filled the automatic doors of St. Vincent's ER with the kind of presence that made Alan Reeves, the security guard who had been sitting behind his desk reading a paperback thriller, stand up without quite knowing why. Duke was 51 years old, broad as a barn door, with a grey beard that had gone the colour of storm clouds and eyes the pale blue of a winter sky. He wore his cut over a flannel the colour of dried earth. Behind him, in the parking lot visible through the glass, motorcycles were arriving in ones and twos, their engines dropping to silence in a way that somehow made the quiet louder. Ray was standing near the window when Duke walked in. Duke took one look at his face before looking past him to the corner where Tara Whitfield still sat, a paper cup of water in her hands that Sandra the nurse had brought her without being asked. "Talk to me," Duke said. Ray told him. Not dramatically. Ray had never been a dramatic man, but completely. The woman, the pregnancy, the stairs, the husband on his way. Duke listened with the particular quality of attention that had made him effective as the chapter's VP for 11 years. Entirely present, pale eyes still, expression unreadable until he chose to change it. When Ray finished, Duke looked at the woman in the corner for a moment without speaking. She say his name. Pete Morrison, drives a white Silverado, 2019, Arizona plate. Duke nodded once. He pulled out his own phone, stepped to the side, and made 2 calls that lasted approximately 90 seconds combined. By the time he hung up, 6 more bikers had come through the automatic doors. Alan Reeves had gotten to his feet behind his desk with the expression of someone who very much wanted to make a decision and was waiting to understand what the right decision was. Ray walked over to him. "We're not here for trouble," Ray said. He said it the same way he said most things, without ornamentation, without softening. "There's a pregnant woman in that corner who got pushed down a flight of stairs tonight by her husband. He knows she's here and she's scared he's going to show up. We're going to sit here until she's seen to and safe." Alan looked at Ray. He looked at the growing number of men in leather cuts filling the waiting area. He looked at the woman in the corner, who was watching all of this with her paper cup held in both hands, her eyes moving through what appeared to be a significant recalibration of the night's possibilities. "I'm going to have to call this in," Alan said carefully. "That's fine," Ray said. "Call it in." He went back to his seat. Sandra Poole had emerged from the triage bay and stopped near the nurse's station, taking in the situation with the measuring look of someone who had been working emergency medicine long enough to develop a calibrated sense for what was dangerous and what only appeared to be. She crossed the room and crouched beside Tara, speaking quietly. Ray couldn't hear what was said, but he watched Tara's face. The careful set of it shift slightly. Not relax, but shift. More men arrived. By midnight, there were 19 of them in the waiting room. Some of the other patients, the man with the ice pack, the teenagers, the woman with the magazine, had quietly relocated or been moved to other areas by the nursing staff. There was no scene, no raised voices, no performance of any kind. The bikers occupied chairs and stretches of wall with the compact efficiency of men who understood how to fill a space without escalating it. Ray sat in his original chair. His hand had been seen to 6 stitches, a bandage, a tetanus booster he didn't argue about, and now he sat with his elbows on his knees and his eyes on the entrance. Tara had been taken back for evaluation. Mr. T. Alan Webb, the attending physician, a compact man in his late 40s with a runner's build and careful hands, had appeared briefly in the waiting room doorway, and Ray had watched his expression move through several phases when he registered the assembled group before settling on something that looked like controlled professional concern. He'd spoken to Sandra. Sandra had said something that made him nod twice and disappear back through the doors. Duke settled into the chair beside Ray. 23 confirmed, Duke said quietly. More on the way. Chet's bringing the guys from Chandler. Ray nodded. She going to be okay? Duke asked. The baby? Don't know yet. They sat in silence for a moment. Outside, through the glass, the parking lot had filled with motorcycles, arranged with a kind of unconscious order. Side by side, nose out, the way men who rode together for years naturally organized themselves, as if the road instinct didn't switch off just because the engines had. You know what gets me, Duke said, not to anyone in particular, keeping his voice low in the way he had when he was thinking out loud and wanted it heard anyway. Somebody's going to drive past this parking lot tonight and see 40 bikes outside an emergency room and think they should call the police. Alan already called it in, Ray said. Right, but here's the thing. Duke looked at the floor for a moment. That same person won't think twice about the white Silverado that shows up and parks right in front of the entrance, because that's just a truck, ordinary, clean. Ray looked at him. Duke's pale eyes were calm. The dangerous thing in this situation is the ordinary-looking thing, he said. It always is. Ray thought about Tara's face. The high, vivid bruise, the fingerprint marks on her arm. He thought about the word Pete and what it represented. A man who probably looked fine at a neighborhood barbecue, who probably shook hands firmly and kept his lawn mowed and knew exactly when to deploy concern and when to deploy charm. Yeah, Ray said. The automatic doors opened again. 8 more men walked in, including a barrel-chested man named Chet Dawson, who had arms like railroad ties and who nodded at Ray across the room, the way men nod at each other when words are unnecessary and the situation has already been understood. 31. Somewhere in the back of the hospital, behind the swinging doors, and the smell of antiseptic and the steady rhythm of monitors, a woman named Tara Whitfield lay on an examination table while a doctor assessed the damage, and a baby that hadn't yet been born registered what it could not understand, that the world outside the warmth was complicated and loud and sometimes cruel, and that tonight, for reasons that would take years to fully explain, 41 strangers had decided that mattered. The white Silverado had not appeared yet, but Ray was watching the entrance. He arrived at 1:14 in the morning. Ray saw the headlights first, the way they swept the far wall of the waiting room as the vehicle turned into the emergency entrance lane. He recognized the particular rhythm of a truck's approach before the vehicle itself came into view, the slight differential in headlight position, higher than a car's, wider set. White Silverado, clean, recent wash. The kind of truck that got washed regularly, that gleamed under parking lot lights in a way that announced its owner cared about appearances. Ray didn't stand, didn't move toward the door. He sat where he was and watched. Pete Morrison was not what most people would have expected. That was, Ray had come to understand, exactly the point. He was 34, maybe, with a medium build that suggested he'd played some sport in college and hadn't entirely given it up. He wore a dark button-down shirt tucked into jeans, the shirt slightly wrinkled in the way of someone who'd dressed in a hurry. Clean-shaven. Brown hair cut close and neat. He walked through the automatic doors with the expression of a man who was concerned, eyebrows drawn together, mouth tight, the particular performance of worry that people put on when they wanted to signal the emotion rather than actually feel it. He stopped. The sight of 32 men in biker cuts filling the waiting room of a Phoenix ER at 1 in the morning was, Ray had to admit, probably not what Pete Morrison had scripted on the drive over. Pete stood in the entrance and did what people did when they encountered something that disrupted their script. He recalibrated. Ray could see it happening. The rapid visual sweep, the shoulders pulling back, the chin lifting slightly in the way of a man who used dominance as a default setting and was looking for the relevant hierarchy in any room he entered. His eyes landed on Ray. Ray held his gaze without changing his expression. "I'm looking for my wife," Pete said. He pitched his voice at the room, confident, reasonable, the voice of a man accustomed to being listened to. "Tara Morrison. She's pregnant. She had an accident." The word accident settled into the room with the quiet weight of a stone dropped in still water. No one responded immediately. That was not planned. It simply happened, the natural consequence of 32 men who had collectively made a decision and were not particularly moved by the way Pete Morrison chose to present himself. Alan Reeves had relocated to a position near the nurses' station, and Ray could see him on his radio, the conversation quiet and ongoing. Officer Tom Briggs had arrived 20 minutes prior, a broad man in his 40s with a flat expression and the watchful eyes of someone who'd worked enough domestic calls to understand exactly what category of room he'd walked into, and was standing near the entrance to the triage area with his arms loosely crossed. Pete turned to Officer Briggs. "Officer, I'm looking for my wife. She was brought in. She fell down the stairs at our home." Briggs looked at him for a moment before responding. "Sir, are you Pete Morrison?" "I am. Yes. Can you tell me where—" "I'm going to need you to step over here with me for a moment," Briggs said. His tone was even. Professional. He gestured toward a corner of the room away from the main cluster of bikers. Pete's expression flickered, just briefly. Then the concerned husband reasserted itself seamlessly, like a trained reflex. "Of course. I just want to make sure Tara is okay. This way, please." Pete followed. Ray watched them from across the room, the officer's steady posture, Pete's careful performance of cooperation, the slight tension in his jaw that was the only visible signal of whatever pressure was building underneath the press shirt. Sandra Poole came through the swinging doors. She crossed to Ray and spoke quietly beside him. "She's asking what's happening out here," Sandra said. "I told her he hadn't arrived yet. That was 15 minutes ago." She paused. "She started shaking when I told her he was on his way." Ray looked at her. "The baby? Dr. Webb thinks she's okay. He wants to run a few more tests and keep her for observation, but no signs of—" Sandra measured her next words. "Nothing catastrophic, which isn't to say what happened wasn't serious. She know about—" Ray gestured, a small movement that took in the room. Sandra's expression shifted. I told her people were here. I didn't... She glanced at the assembled men. I didn't tell her how many. Tell her, Ray said. I think she should know. Sandra looked at him for a moment with the evaluating look of a person deciding whether a piece of information will help or overwhelm. Then she nodded and went back through the doors. Across the room, Pete Morrison's performance of cooperation was developing fissures. Ray could see it in his posture, the contained frustration of a man accustomed to controlling situations, encountering one he could not control. His eyes kept moving from Briggs to the room to the swinging doors that led to the triage area, cycling through the available angles and finding none of them workable. I don't understand, Pete was saying, his voice still modulated, but with an edge entering it now. She's my wife. She's carrying my child. I have every right to... Sir, Briggs said, she's being evaluated. I need to ask you some questions about what happened tonight. I told you what happened. She fell. What time? A pause. Around 9:30. And you waited until now to come to the hospital. Not a question. Briggs had delivered it as a plain statement. Pete caught the shape of it. I called her. She didn't answer. I didn't know she'd come here. I thought, who did she call after the fall? Another pause. Shorter this time, but Ray clocked it. I don't know, Pete said. Her sister, maybe. Duke had been sitting beside Ray the entire time, with the stillness of someone who was very attentive and very patient. He leaned forward slightly now, elbows on knees, and spoke just above a breath. He knew she called her sister, Duke said. He mentioned it like an afterthought, but he knew. Watch his eyes when he answers the next question. Ray said nothing. He watched Pete Morrison in the corner with Officer Briggs, watched the careful architecture of the man's presentation beginning to show its load-bearing walls, the places where the structure was not as solid as the surface suggested. The room held. By now there were close to 40 men occupying every available surface of the waiting room, with several more visible through the glass in the parking lot, sitting on bikes or standing on the asphalt in the November cold. The hospital, with the pragmatic intelligence of people who had a job to do and were doing it, had stopped deliberating about asking them to leave. Dr. Webb appeared briefly in the doorway to the triage area. He looked at Officer Briggs. A look passed between them, the compact, efficient communication of men who had navigated enough difficult situations to do it without wasting words. Briggs stepped slightly away from Pete Morrison and spoke quietly into his radio. Pete stood alone in the corner of the waiting room of St. Vincent Medical Center, in his clean, button-down shirt, with the slight wrinkle of hurry, and looked around at the room. The room looked back. At 2:08 in the morning, the swinging doors from the triage area opened, and Tara Whitfield walked through them. She was wearing a hospital gown over her clothes, the kind they gave patients when they needed to examine them and then discharge still wearing for practicality. Her auburn hair was still pulled to one side. The bruise on her cheekbone had darkened in the past 2 hours, purple now at the center, fading to yellow-green at the edges in the way of bruises that carried history. Her bottom lip bore a small adhesive strip at the corner. She walked carefully, the way people moved when they were aware of pain, but had decided not to be governed by it. Sandra Poole walked beside her. Tara stepped through the doors and stopped. The waiting room, 41 men Ray had finally counted, went quiet in a way that was different from ordinary quiet. It was the kind of quiet that had a tension in it. Weight. The kind of quiet that meant something. She looked at them. At the cuts and the tattoos and the beards and the worn boots and the sheer, undeniable fact of them, filling every plastic chair and stretching along every wall and visible through the glass of the entrance, standing among the motorcycles in the cold Phoenix night in November, her face did something complicated, not fear. That was the first thing Ray noticed. He had been watching her face carefully since the first moment he'd seen her in the corner with her cup of water and her necessary stillness. It wasn't fear. It was something closer to what happened when a person who has been holding their breath for a very long time finally remembers that breathing is permitted. The particular expression of someone encountering an unexpected answer to a question they'd stopped believing was answerable. Her eyes found Ray. He was still in his chair. He didn't stand. He nodded at her once. The same uncomplicated acknowledgement he'd offered 2 hours ago when she was a stranger and he was filling out a form and the night had been an ordinary night. She pressed her lips together, looked at the room again, the full sweep of it. Then she looked at Pete. Pete Morrison had not moved from his corner. He was standing very still now, with the careful stillness of someone who had recognized that movement of any kind would be the wrong kind. Officer Briggs was positioned beside him, close enough that the fact of his presence was impossible to ignore or minimize. Tara looked at her husband for a long moment. The room watched her look at him. It was the look of someone who had spent a significant portion of their life managing the temperature of a space, calculating, adjusting, minimizing, and who had just arrived at the particular, irreversible moment when they decided to stop. Then she walked to Officer Briggs. She spoke to him directly, with a clarity that Ray would think about for a long time afterward, the clarity of someone who had made a decision and was no longer bearing the accumulated weight of almost making it. "He pushed me," she said. "We were at the top of the stairs. He was angry because I'd spoken to my sister without telling him first, and he pushed me, both hands in the center of my back." She kept her eyes on Briggs, steady and unflinching. "This is not the first time he has hurt me. I have photographs on my phone from 2 previous incidents that I never showed anyone." The room was very quiet. Pete's face went through a series of changes that Ray watched with the same detached attention he might have applied to watching weather move across the desert. First, the denial tried to assemble itself, the practiced expression of wrongful accusation, the mouth beginning to form her name. But the room was full of 41 men who were looking at him, and whatever internal mechanism allowed Pete Morrison to project himself convincingly into the spaces where he'd operated, alone with her, or in the company of people who hadn't been watching, that mechanism seemed to fail to engage under the current conditions. What replaced the performance for just a moment was what was actually there. Ray saw it. Duke saw it. He was certain that Sandra Poole, who had 30 years of reading human faces in emergency conditions, saw it too. Not rage, not even contempt. Just the flat, pragmatic calculation of a man whose primary orientation toward the world was what is the best available outcome for me, who was running the numbers on the current situation and finding them comprehensively unworkable. "Sir," Officer Briggs said, and his voice had changed, the professional evenness still intact, but carrying a specific gravity now that had not been there before. "I need you to turn around and put your hands behind your back." "This is—" Pete started. The sentence had nowhere useful to go. Pete Morrison was, above all else, a man who used words instrumentally. Useless words didn't fit the template. He turned around. He put his hands behind his back. The sound of the handcuffs was small and precise in the quiet room, a clean, definitive sound. Officer Christine Marola, who had arrived 20 minutes earlier and taken a position near the entrance, came forward and assisted Briggs in walking Pete toward the exit. As they moved through the rows of bikers, no one moved, no one spoke, no one needed to. The fact of 41 people sitting and standing in witness was already a complete statement, and complete statements don't require additions. Pete Morrison was walked through the automatic doors and into the parking lot and did not look back. Ray stood up. He crossed the room to where Tara was standing. Sandra had stayed at her side, and a second nurse had joined them, but Tara's eyes were on the door through which her husband had just left, and her expression was the particular expression of someone processing the reality of a thing they have imagined so many times that the actual event feels slightly displaced, more like recognizing something than experiencing it for the first time. Ray stopped a few feet away. He didn't close the remaining distance. "You okay?" he asked. She looked at him. A small sound escaped her that was not quite a laugh and not quite crying. Something in between, the audible version of a breath finally released after holding far too long. "No," she said, "but I think I'm going to be." Duke came up beside Ray. Tara looked at the older man, at his storm-grey beard and pale eyes, and the 51 years of wear that sat on him the way weathering sat on good hardwood. "We'll stay," Duke said simply, "until you've got someone coming for you and you're ready to go. We're not in any hurry." Tara looked at him, then at the room again, at the bikers who were now shifting slightly, the tension of the previous hours releasing into something that was not relaxed exactly, but settled. One of them was on his phone near the window. Two were talking quietly by the coffee machine. Chet Dawson, arms like railroad ties, was explaining something to Alan Reeves at the security desk, and Alan was nodding slowly with the expression of someone significantly revising a prior version of the world. "Why?" Tara asked. The question was addressed to both of them, or perhaps to the room itself. "You don't know me." Ray considered the question. It wasn't rhetorical. She was genuinely asking, in the way of someone who needed the answer to make sense before she could accept that it was real. "Because you asked for help," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "I didn't ask," she said. "I just said it." "Same thing," Ray said, "when the person you say it to is paying attention." Dr. Webb appeared in the triage doorway. He took in the room with the expression of a man who had revised his expectations several times during the course of this night and was no longer attempting to hold on to any particular set of them. He crossed to where Tara stood. Tara. He had adjusted the name without being asked, and the fact of it, the small, deliberate adjustment, made her look at him directly. "The baby is doing well. Heartbeat is strong and steady. I want to keep you under observation through the morning just to be certain, but I'm cautiously optimistic. You both came through this." She put her hand on her belly. The same reflexive protectiveness Ray had noticed in the very first minutes, in the corner when she'd been a stranger sitting still, but the quality of it had changed subtly, less like shielding, more like reassurance. A hand that said, "We made it," instead of "I'm protecting you from what's coming." "Okay," she said. "Okay." The sun came up over Phoenix at 6:24 in the morning, which Ray knew because he was in the parking lot when it happened, his back against a concrete pillar, a gas station coffee in his bandaged hand. Sandra had produced it from somewhere around 5 o'clock, appearing in the parking lot doorway and holding it out without explanation, and he had taken it without asking, and the Arizona sky doing what it did in November, burning the desert horizon, a deep amber that had no equivalent in anything manufactured. Most of the men had stayed through the night. That was the part that Ray hadn't planned, and that Duke hadn't organized, and that had simply happened, the way things happened when people made individual decisions that aligned without discussion. Chet had dozed in 2 plastic chairs pushed together, boots crossed, beard on his chest. Terry Bright, 23 years old and the newest member of the chapter, had not slept at all. He'd been awake the entire night, sitting near the window with the focused, unblinking attention of someone experiencing something that was arranging itself into a permanent memory in real time. He would talk about this night, Ray thought, for the rest of his life. He would tell the story at tables and around fires and to people who hadn't been there, and the story would be true, and that would be its own kind of remarkable thing. By 3 in the morning, the hospital staff had quietly stopped processing the presence of the bikers and had begun, in the way of busy and practical people, simply working around them. Sandra had appeared with a cart of coffee cups at some point after midnight. No one had requested it. She'd just done it. Officer Tom Briggs had returned near 3:30, after what Ray gathered had been a longer intake conversation at the precinct than Pete Morrison had anticipated or prepared for. Briggs had asked Ray a few questions. how he knew Tara, what exactly had been said in the waiting room, and Ray had answered precisely and without ornamentation, which Briggs seemed to understand and appreciate. Before he left, the officer had stood in the waiting room doorway for a moment and looked at the assembled men. "I've been on this job 18 years, he said, not loudly, not to anyone in particular. "I've never seen anything like this." Duke, from his chair by the window, said, "Is that a good thing or a bad thing?" Briggs considered this with what appeared to be genuine thoughtfulness. "Good," he said. "Definitely good." And he left. At 5 in the morning, Tara's sister arrived. Her name was Gail Whitfield, a woman in her mid-30s with the same auburn hair and a face that showed clearly she had been driving with the particular urgency of someone who had received a call that reconfigured everything she thought the night was going to be. She came through the automatic doors and stopped at the sight of the room in the same way everyone stopped, a half-second recalibration, a visible adjustment, and then she said, "Where is she?" with the single-minded focus of a person who has a priority that overrides everything else in the room. Sandra took her back. Ray heard the reunion through the swinging doors. Not words, just the quality of sound that passed through the walls, muffled and complete, the kind of sound that was its own story, told entirely without language. He went outside then, into the pre-dawn cool of the Phoenix November, and stood against the concrete pillar with his coffee and his thoughts. He thought about what Duke had said in the early hours. The dangerous thing is the ordinary-looking thing. He thought about Pete Morrison's clean truck and pressed shirt, about the architecture of the man's presentation in that waiting room, the concerned husband, the careful language, the practiced performance of a person who understood bone deep that performance was protection. That if you looked right and sounded right, and deployed the correct expressions at the correct moments, you could conduct a significant portion of your life behind cover. And he thought about the way the room had looked. 41 men who, to most people encountering them in most contexts, would read as the most dangerous presence in any given space. Men whose appearance had been used by decades of cultural shorthand to mean something specific. Threat, avoid, dangerous. Men who arrived at a hospital in the middle of the night and were reported to the police before they had sat down, before they had said a word, before anyone in that waiting room had any information about them whatsoever, other than what they looked like. Men who had then proceeded to sit in plastic chairs for 6 hours and drink bad coffee and doze and talk quietly among themselves and accept cups from a nurse who'd chosen to extend the courtesy, and who had done all of this for a woman none of them had ever met, for no reason that could be reduced to self-interest or obligation or calculation. Ray was not naive about the Hells Angels. He had been riding with the chapter for 19 years and understood the organization with the full-dimensional understanding of someone genuinely on the inside, its history, its complexity, the parts that were not simple or comfortable or easy to defend. He was not constructing an argument for uncomplicated virtue, but he was thinking about the gap between appearance and actuality, about how the world operated largely on appearance because appearance was faster and more efficient than inquiry, and how that efficiency worked out fine until the moment it didn't, until the moment the actual threat came in a clean truck and a pressed shirt, and the actual protection arrived in leather and tattoos and was instinctively treated as the thing to be feared. Duke came out of the hospital at 6, just as the sky was beginning its amber burn over the eastern edge of the city. He stood beside Ray and looked at the horizon without speaking for a while. That was a thing about Duke. He had a comfortable relationship with silence. He didn't feel the need to fill it. "She's sleeping," he said finally. Sandra let Gail know. "They're keeping her through the morning, and then Gail's taking her home." He paused. "Her home, not—" He didn't finish the distinction. He didn't need to. "Pete?" Ray asked. "Charged. Domestic violence assault on a pregnant woman, a couple of other things Briggs mentioned. Duke's pale eyes were calm and steady. He's in the system. It's going to follow him. Good. In the parking lot, motorcycles were departing in ones and twos as men who had held through the night made their way home into the early Phoenix morning. Chet had left an hour earlier, clasping Ray's hand at the exit and saying nothing because nothing needed to be said, and the nothing that was said contained everything. Terry Bright had left with the Chandler group, and Ray had noticed that the young man's face as he walked out carried a particular quality, the expression of someone who had been changed by the preceding hours in a way he wouldn't fully articulate or understand for months. "She asked about you," Duke said. "Through Sandra. She wanted to know. She said she didn't have any money right now, that things were complicated, but she wanted—" He stopped, choosing how to deliver the next part. Duke was not a man who deliberated often, and when he did, it was worth noting. "Sandra told her you were out here," Duke said. "And then Tara said—" He paused one more time. "She said to tell you that she's going to name her daughter after the night this happened." He looked at the horizon. November. Ray was quiet. The amber was deepening now, the desert doing what the desert did, burning beautiful and indifferent above the highways and the hospitals and the parking lots full of motorcycles and the ordinary, extraordinary complexity of human lives unfolding inside all of it, simultaneously right now, in every direction. He thought about a girl who would grow up with the name November, who would ask about it someday, in the way children eventually asked about the things that set them apart. Who would hear the story, the waiting room, the 41 men, the long November night when her mother decided to stop being afraid, and who would carry some version of it forward into a life that hadn't happened yet. He thought about what he hoped she would take from it, not the fear, not the violence that preceded the night, but the waiting room itself, the specific, unrepeatable fact of 41 people who had no obligation to be there choosing to be there anyway. No contract. No formal agreement. Just a phone call in the middle of the night and a door that kept opening and men who showed up because a woman was frightened, and that was sufficient reason. He thought about what the story would tell her about people, about the gap between what they appeared to be and what they were capable of. About the possibility that the most reliable measure of a person had nothing to do with what they looked like, and everything to do with what they did at 1 in the morning when no one was watching, and there was nothing to gain. "You heading out?" Duke asked. Ray finished his coffee, looked at the hospital entrance through the glass, at Sandra Poole, already moving again inside, attending to whoever came next with the same unhurried competence she'd applied all night, as she would the next night and the one after, because that was who she was when no one was watching too. "Yeah," he said, "I'm heading out." He pushed off the concrete pillar, walked through the parking lot to where his bike sat at the far end of a long, mostly empty row. The last few remaining like period marks at the end of a sentence that had taken all night to write. He swung his leg over the seat with the ease of a man doing something he'd done 10,000 times. He started the engine. The exhaust note rose into the November morning air, familiar, definite, the sound of something that knew where it was going. Ray Callahan pulled out of the St. Vincent Medical Center parking lot at 6:31 in the morning, into the burning Phoenix dawn and rode.